Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Coons, and this is my case study for EDL 854, Missing Booster Club Funds. A quick summary of this case study is that the case study takes place in a city middle school where there's a lot of strong parent support by having parents volunteers both during the school day and after the school day, and these parents have a really good working relationship with the principal. One of these volunteer parents have requested funds for to be used for her daughter's trip to New York. However, the principal refused this funds request. Later, a problem arises where the principal suspects that there are some missing funds at some gate sales for tickets to a sporting event, and the parent who requested these funds is the parent that turned in the tickets and the money that night. So this problem that arises is between the parent volunteer, the principal, and it is regarding possible missing Booster Club funds, and a resolution for this is needed. Category 1, the problem identification and analysis. What do I know? I know that the school has roughly a population of 450 students. The student population over the last 10 years has been declining due to several of the young families moving to suburb areas, and those that are left behind are older community members that have no children in the schools, and then those of lower socioeconomic means, and they cannot afford to move into the suburbs. The school does offer various activities and events, including sports, at their school. Parents mainly work at a textile mill that's local there in the city, and although a lot of the parents are working, they still provide a lot of strong school support, and these volunteers volunteer for reading programs, different activities and events, such as concessions and ticket sales at sporting events, as like the one mentioned in the case study. The principal relies heavily on these parent volunteers. We know that there are procedures in place for ticket and money counting processes, and we know that the principal refused this funds request by one of these parent volunteers, and now the principal has a reason to wonder whether or not $50 may be missing from the ticket sales one night, because the principal is aware that one of the patrons paid with a $50 bill, and upon counting all of the funds that night, there was not a $50 bill in the money that was supposed to be deposited for the ticket sales. Things that I need to know are, first, were these careful counting procedures followed? If they were followed, who was the second person at the gate that was counting the gate proceeds with Mrs. Bowman, the volunteer who turned the tickets and funds over that night? Another thing I think would be important to know is how long has Mrs. Bowman volunteered at the school? We know that she had 2 older boys and currently has this girl that she was hoping to use some PTA funds for her trip to New York. However, it was not explicit in whether or not Mrs. Bowman has volunteered while the boys were in school as well. Another thing that would be important to know is if there are any lingering bad feelings about the funds denial. Also, does the principal have any reasons to have concerns or questions concerning Mrs. Bowman's conduct previously? I think that's an important question when we're talking about trust. Another question I have, are 2 tickets missing or are 10 tickets missing? The case study states both. The case study says that Mrs. Bowman wrote a note saying tickets 78 and 88 were missing. However, in the next sentence and in the following few other sentences, it explains that proceeds for 10 tickets are missing and 10 tickets were torn. Either way, it's important to find out if proceeds are actually missing. Another question I have is, could the $50 have been used for change that night? If all the parents work in the same textile mill, it's pretty safe to assume payday would be the same for everyone, and other parents could have cashed their paychecks that night as well. Therefore, a parent could have paid with a $100 bill at the gate, and maybe that $50 bill that should have been there was actually used for change for that ticket sale. And then the last thing I think is important to know is how to best proceed without damaging any of these parent relationships. While there are many issues present in our case study, I believe the problem is that the principal suspects that some funds are missing. Category 2, my proposed plan of action and appropriate implementation strategies. My first step in my plan of action is to check the trash. While gross sounding, it may just pay off. My strategies for implementation are to first go to the gate trash and determine if there are any torn tickets. If the trash is gone, you could check with custodial staff to find the trash. If the tickets are found, then the number of torn tickets can be determined, and then the principal can decipher whether or not funds are missing. If the torn tickets are found and the funds balance, then the principal can proceed to step number 4 of my action plan. However, if the tickets are not found, then the principal needs to make a decision on whether or not to follow through with my steps 2 or 3. The principal will need to balance the need for trusting the volunteers and the need for securing student funds. The principal needs to demonstrate a commitment for trusting stakeholders and their involvement in the management of these funds and activities. My second plan of action is to identify the second person. The strategy of implementation is to find the second person who was at the gate with Mrs. Bowman. To second, determine if tickets were torn and if so, how many. And then third, determine if the counting procedures were followed. Depending on the answers given in this discussion, the principal could decide to proceed with step 3 or move on to step 4. Step 3 of my action plan would be to communicate with the volunteer. I would start the steps of implementation by explaining to the volunteer how much the school is thankful for their reliable and valued volunteer time and service. I would describe that night's events and then ask what they think could have happened to the funds. Could the 50 have been issued in change? Also, you might need to ask some hard questions such as, are there lingering hurt feelings with the denial of the PTA funds request with Mrs. Bowman? As all principals should do, you should document this discussion, including the time, the place, and any comments made during this discussion. Also, the principal will have to determine whether or not any further action is needed concerning this parent's volunteering. The steps from here on out should be followed no matter what the principal decides to do. The fourth plan of action is to create a new policy. My strategies of implementation are to create a torn ticket policy where all torn tickets are physically kept and then turned in with the receipts and reports for that night's ticket sales. This way, there should be no question about whether or not tickets were torn, and if they were torn, how many. You should decide upon this reporting procedure and the specific steps to be followed, and then you should communicate this new policy to parent volunteers so that they can then follow through with the procedure and policy. My fifth plan of action is to evaluate volunteer placement. The strategies of implementation are first to evaluate where parent volunteers are assigned. We know in our case study that the principal was so busy with supervisory duties that he was unable to oversee the money collection and accounting for that night. The principal could decide to place parent volunteers in a different place so that then the principal would be available for these overseeing duties. Also, the principal could explore the idea of needing additional volunteers. If an additional volunteer was placed to do the supervisory duties, then the principal would become available to oversee these counting and accounting procedures every night. Category 3, my resolution based on success for all students. Step 1, checking the trash. Safeguarding funds is what's best for all students. Checking the trash is helping to safeguard these funds. By finding out whether or not tickets were torn, and if so, how many, this helps to safeguard funds. And as our text states, safeguarding of funds for collected and unsold tickets is the responsibility of the event coordinator. In this instance, in our case study, this would be the principal. My second step of identifying the second person. Following our approved policy is what's best for all students. It's important that principals and event coordinators follow all district policy and never go outside those guidelines. Also, our text states that financial safeguards and controls are needed to ensure that funds are not lost, misused, or stolen. By identifying the second person and then finding out if procedures were followed, this helps to determine whether funds were lost, misused, or stolen. The third step would be to communicate with the volunteer. Effective communication is what's best for all students. As an administrator, you're going to have to balance the need for your own comfort with the need of students' rights to these funds. It's important that you handle any concerns rapidly so that the issue doesn't escalate. And it's important that you ensure that there are corrective measures in place so that if things like funds were misused, lost, or stolen, that this can be corrected. My fourth step of creating this new policy: corrective policy is best for students. Solving problems associated with ticket sales is important, but it also is important that you learn from the experience so that it doesn't happen again. By making sure that you have a corrective policy in place, you can prevent this from happening in the future. Step 5, evaluating volunteer placement. Evaluation of all procedures is what's best for students. We know that having volunteers is critical to having activities and events for our students. These parent volunteers provide such a valuable service. By evaluating where parent volunteers are posted, this alleviates those duties so that then the principal could be available to oversee the money collection and accounting, as stated in our case study. Debriefing the problem. Things I was thinking, feeling, and valuing are: I was thinking, would Mrs. Bowman really steal the funds? She's been such a good volunteer. Could that really happen? I was definitely thinking we needed a new policy like the torn ticket policy, and I also was wondering and thinking, what additional support could the principal provide? I was feeling a lack of trust for some parent volunteers. I was also feeling thankful for these volunteers. While feeling thankful, and then also this lack of trust, I was also feeling this is a complex issue. It's not really black or white. I was also valuing the relationships between the parent, volunteers, the community, and the school. I was valuing student success and also valuing the benefit that having these volunteers provides for our students. Things that are open to further investigation are: what could be done to encourage that all procedures are followed so that this doesn't happen again? How can we best safeguard funds so that all students can benefit? And how can we maintain positive volunteer relationships so that volunteers continue in the future? My reflection. Component 1, my plan promotes effective and efficient school management by building relationships with these volunteers, by making sure that there's trust and good feelings between us, by nurturing a culture of integrity and ethics, and also by monitoring the financial operations and making any changes as necessary. Component 2, my plan promotes social learning of every student by, first, opening up effective channels of communication, by understanding the impact that funds provided by the services rendered by these student volunteers, that impact and the extra learning opportunities that they can provide for students, and also by committing to these procedures that prove that we have safe and ethical practices in place so that we can best support our students' interests. Component 3, my plan promotes student academic learning by building relationships with parents and other community members, by providing access to funds for better learning opportunities, by empowering parents to support their child's learning, and by strengthening relationships, building trust and credibility between the school and community. Thank you for watching.